It is a battle for eyeballs, it's a battle for hearts and minds, and it is going to be an increasing challenge that us as humanitarians are going to have to grapple with.
Welcome to Rethinking Humanitarianism, a show that explores the future of aid in a world of rising crises. I'm your host, Tamam Al-Audat, CEO of the New Humanitarian. Famines, plagues, armed conflicts, and refugee struggles are all pressing stories about human existence at its extremes. They are things that people write novels and make movies and TV shows about, that have audience glued to the page or to their screens. But when they happen in the real world, it is hard to get people to pay attention for more than a passing moment. Do we have an empathy deficit? Or is the media's coverage of humanitarian stories and crises missing the mark? Our producer Levi Sharp went out to Washington Square Park in New York City to talk to a range of people about their feelings about the aid sector and whether humanitarianism has a marketing or image problem.
I've never really thought of this word. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Humanitarianism or humanitarian?
Can you define the word for me, honestly?
I don't know. Could you define humanitarian for me?
I do think it does have a marketing problem. I think
it does have an image issue.
Yes, I think it does have a potential marketing problem.
I think that everything has an imaging problem in this capitalist world.
I feel like the UN doesn't really have any power anymore. Countries just do whatever they want.
But I'm sure people are doing very good things and working hard, but being undermined by the powers that be.
It would be very difficult for me to imagine that any individual is able to act in an extremely radical way.
Individualism has taken the forefront for society. Everyone's just thinking about themselves.
people don't care as much about other people as maybe I wish they would.
A lack of empathy amongst our society that has led a lot of people to maybe feel defeated.
Social media has left people feeling more disconnected from each other. As a result of that, humanity and humanitarianism suffers.
I think it's a lot easier to be distracted nowadays, and I think that there's a lot of competing items for our attention. There's a lot of other quick fixes that might be more on the surface appealing for people.
You say humanitarian, people think of aid camps in war-torn areas, and of course that's part of humanitarianism, but that's the small part. That terminology is associated with, I don't live in those places. It's great that they're helping people who literally have nothing, but in a way, the brand gets diluted because people think that's what it is.
I think a lot of people need to see how their lives are affected, how the defunding of certain programs are causing more harm than good. I think there needs to be something to fill that gap for people to really understand the full implications.
I think maybe just showing how it works, when is it effective, I think that can definitely help get people excited to feel like my efforts are actually doing something, because I think people are very pessimistic right now, and when they try to help, they might feel that it's not actually helping.
When we invited UN Relief Chief Tom Fletcher onto the show, he said an interesting thing about the state of humanitarianism.
I do think somewhere along the way we invented the way we put jargon, made it sound as though this was brain science, what we're doing, as opposed to basic human instinct to be humanitarians.
Have we become too wonky to be able to deeply connect with the public about humanitarian needs across the world and why it is important to care? Has the image of the humanitarian gone from aid workers in torn-up jeans trying to make a difference to bureaucrats in business suits? To give some insights on this, I am joined by Sana Beg, Executive Director of MSF Canada. She engages with many of the different teams in MSF, identifying pain points in the humanitarian sector and how it can make steps to evolve. I'm also joined by Dr. Polly Pallister-Wilkins, Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Amsterdam. She researches and teaches about the humanitarian sector, shaping the minds of our next generation of aid workers. At the time of this recording, I was in Catania, Sicily, covering the Global Smooth Flotilla. a coordinated, non-violent fleet of mostly small vessels sailing from ports across the Mediterranean to break the Israeli siege and deliver aid to Gaza, which is referenced in this roundtable. If you have any questions or comments, stick around for the credits to learn about how to reach us here at Rethinking Humanitarianism. Sana, Polly, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
There's something that I've noticed for a long time, but was much more illuminated by the recent dismantling of USAID. And this is the fact that, unlike other issues, foreign aid and humanitarianism doesn't really elicit the same kind of care, fervor, collective action from people in the streets. So the first thing I want to ask you, why do you think that is? Why didn't people go to the streets to object or protest the cuts to USAID or to the cuts in the UK or others? Sana, what do you think?
I think we're at an interesting moment in time as it comes to the intersection of humanitarianism and how people consume content. I've often said that the scarcest resource in the 21st century is, in fact, human attention, and it is getting all the more scarce today. We are living in a world, those of us in the humanitarian aid space, are compounded by polycrises, increasing consecutive, ongoing crises across the world, limited resources. And what happens to the people consuming that content of the unending needs that they're seeing in the world? I find that there's a disruption happening in many ways there. One is there is a natural empathy fatigue that we're seeing with audiences. We're living in a day and age where the ability to live stream genocides, to live stream what's happening around the world is at your fingertips. At the same time, you're one thumb scroll away from something a bit more lighter and more appealing. How do we hold on and how do we make the thumb scrolling go to thumb stopping and have you meaningfully connect with the content that you're seeing? It is a battle for eyeballs. It's a battle for hearts and minds. And it is going to be an increasing challenge that us as humanitarians are going to have to grapple with. Add to that the disruptive nature of AI, the elements of mistrust that will come in with misinformation and disinformation. Chimamanda Adichie and Ngozi Adichie's Danger of a Single Story, the popular TED Talk. There is a tendency today, and our brainwaves are becoming accustomed to only reading the top headline, only seeing that 30-second video, and losing the context. Gone are those days of having us stop in our tracks at a full-page print ad or a deep dive investigative story about a complex humanitarian context. The paradox is the humanitarian contexts are getting even more complex, and our brains are designed to absorb only 30 seconds worth of what deserves a history of context and a deep dive.
Polly, what Sana is saying is interesting. People do not have the attention span, and they don't. And we are doom scrolling day and night and struggling with keeping our attention on any given story. How do you feel about this being a problem of people's attention rather than of humanitarianism's position itself?
I actually want to answer this in 3 different ways, and I'll get to the humanitarianism's part at the end. But I do think there is something important to think about in the way that we consume media today, right? So Sana started to talk about the way that media is consumed, right? You are a media organization, and, we used to have gatekeepers for the media. People got their news through newspapers, and they would sit down and watch the TV news as a family show, and that's how they consumed and they learned about crises, humanitarian crises, other kinds of crises. And of course, that is changing now, right? We have a social media landscape which is so fragmented, right? It's almost impossible to know where to get news from. We have a social media landscape which algorithmically actively suppresses certain types of news. For example, on Twitter, or whatever we call it these days, X, they actively suppress tweets that have links to external websites because they want to keep you on your platform, right? So it becomes very hard for those who are interested or engaged and those who are aiming to engage an audience to actually even find that audience, or for that audience to find the information that they want to find. I also think there's an assumption in a lot of this that there is a lack of engagement. And maybe that's the case, but I'm wondering when this golden age of engagement actually was. Like, are we also being a little bit nostalgic for a past that didn't necessarily actually exist? And are we then also placing that lack of engagement onto humanitarianism as a sector, which is to do what the sector often does, which is to make itself the main character? It assumes the lack of engagement is because of a fault in the sector and not actually wider systemic structural issues in the fact that within the traditional heartlands of the humanitarian world, right, where most of the donor funding comes from, where most of the contributions from regular folks come from that fuel the big INGO sector, right, the West, whether we like that or not, even in the West, life has got so much harder for people. People are working so much harder, their jobs are precarious, not that they don't care, but they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to be engaged in the same way as they may have been in the past. And I don't even know if this past actually really exists in the way that we are assuming that it does.
For our younger audience, what Polly is talking about is, there were days where the TV was thicker and the news came at a certain time. You couldn't click something for the news to come. And the whole family sat actually and listened to the news together. So it was a social event whereby you interacted with other people that exist in your direct space that you trust and live with, whether that is your family or friends or even in a cafe or in a place, and you listen to the news together. It was a social experience that no longer exists today. Now we have pseudonyms, and those of us who still want to torture ourselves and still go on Twitter, it's to rant at other people and hear other people rant at you. There's no social experience in understanding the outside world. This is in itself a change that is significant. And from that angle, we need to understand the world around us and the crises that are happening in places far away. And I mean, Sanai, you run a big organization, a section of MSF, and you come from a communications background as well. How do you see the difference? How do you communicate to a Canadian audience about crises that are so far removed when there is an assault of, whether we want to call it fake news or far right or so on, an alienating and villainizing narrative that is growing against those people who have no power, who are oppressed, who are excluded? How do you talk to your audiences?
That's a battle on a regular basis for our communications teams, for our humanitarian advocacy teams, for that matter, our fundraising teams as well. Tamama, I'll use how you've described it in a previous interview. Yes, I come from a communications background. Yes, I'm running a humanitarian organization, but I also come from a part of the world where home was the humanitarian context and continues to be a humanitarian context. And there's a certain privilege with having that sort of a mobility where you've been able to live through and have real lived experiences in challenging constructs and having seen a bit inside looking out how you are represented in a dignified manner, and now holding the seat and the responsibility that I do today. How do we do right, and how do we show dignified representation of the people that we assist and we claim to assist, and the communities that we claim to assist? What are the challenges that we face in breaking through that attention barrier and breaking through the vilification of marginalized communities? I can say we take it one step at a time. We do a lot of, from a technical perspective, our teams are constantly relying on a lot of data that's available on what's the sentiment analysis around how people are engaging with our content. What are the giving trends? What is, to the point that was being made, economies are getting tougher. It's getting a lot more expensive for people to even contribute their time, their money, or their resources in any way to things that seem quote unquote far away. I do want to talk a little bit about what I liked hearing from Polly as well about this nostalgia for engagement that didn't exist. And I think there's a bit of that still exists today, one that we as MSF are actively challenging, this romanticizing of a certain image of what ideal humanitarianism looks like and what that ideal narrative around humanitarianism looks like. I'm sure we're familiar with labels around what is really global south, what is global north. How do we not engage in quote unquote poverty porn? Do we show flies buzzing around barefoot children sitting in Africa? Or do we engage in those very realistic looking deepfakes that depict that image as well? Is it a white doctor that is treating Black patients? Or is it, the reality for us as MSF? We rely on a robust community of locally hired staff. And how do we ensure that there is a dignified representation of that as well? I would say that there is this constant push and pull between what we want to put out as humanitarian organizations in that market of, yes, increased polarization, societal polarizations, technological rifts that exist, the digital divide that exists between many communities that we're aiming to engage with, and a bit of psychic numbing. Paul Slovic, his work really defined that as the number of victims increases, humanitarian compassion paradoxically decreases. If we were to look at Gaza alone today, how many names do we remember from this conflict? We talk about numbers. Aylan Kurdi was a name that we all vowed never to forget, with the image that showed up of him, washed up on the shore of a beach in his red t-shirt and shorts. There is no such name like that anymore. And that's concerning. Something is happening, either from what humanitarian organizations are communicating or how the media is framing that narrative, that we are erasing the identity of people that are the most vulnerable today. And that's problematic.
There are two lines that I'd like to explore here. One of them is the erasure of identity. And this is a problem that is faced by the politics, but also by the media, by journalism, that the reduction of whole peoples into numbers. And there was a book published recently about Palestinians titled "We Are Not Numbers." And there is also the fatigue of compassion. But there's something beyond that. You'd think stuff like famine, plagues, armed conflicts, refugees, people who exist not too far away, by the way, would elicit some kind of reaction. I mean, there are those of us who can passionately list the characters and catastrophes in Star Wars or in Dune and talk about them as if they exist, and we fail to pay the same level of attention, even remotely, to stuff that are not dissimilar as a narrative arc, but that are actually happening in reality. What's wrong with us? And what's wrong with humanitarians trying to get the attention of people to those crises?
This is really about who gets the privilege of our attention. And there are racist connotations to that. When the Ukraine conflict emerged, you had reporters themselves painting a particular picture of individuals caught in crisis that they look like you and me. They are our blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals in Ukraine. They need our help. Who gets the privilege of our attention? Today, we are dealing with a catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Haiti, and of course, in Gaza. Aside from Gaza, how much of that are you really seeing plastered in the headlines, in your news feeds? How much of that is your algorithm enabling today? This is about who gets the privilege of our attention and how we choose to define that.
That's always been a thing, though, right? There's an assumption in a lot of your questions, Timon, that somehow it's worse now. And I don't know if that's actually the case. And I'm also wondering who it is that you're wanting this attention for. Is it the general public, or is it people who have the power to actually affect change? Because I don't necessarily think that the general public, when they're aware of something, that they don't care. I don't think we can say that the general public, at least where I'm based in the Netherlands, when they're aware of what's going on in Gaza, don't care. We had the biggest protest in like 50 years earlier this year about Gaza. So I don't think you can say people don't care. I think if you look at the response, for example, in 2015 to the refugee crisis, which was, again, a huge media event, again, that people don't care. I think it's what is the effect of that empathy, right? Does it actually have an impact on policy, on governments? I think that's where the problem actually lies. And I absolutely agree with Sana that there are so many conflicts, crises, forms of suffering which are completely overlooked. But again, I don't think that's necessarily a new thing. Marketers working for the American Red Cross figured out in 1905 that they needed to, present crisis and suffering in a particular kind of a way to keep the American public's attention. This is not a new issue. This is not a new concern, even for humanitarians. But I'm wondering then sort of what this marketing, to give it a name, who is it actually for? Is it for the general public, or is it to actually put humanitarian issues on the radar and on the table of politicians, policymakers who actually have the power to affect change? I think that's where you're seeing the lack of empathy, the lack of concern. I don't necessarily think it's actually amongst the general public, as much as we are conditioned to not noticing it through our phones, through the algorithm, as much as we are too busy just trying to pay the rent. But I think once people are aware of what is going on, they do care. I think that it's actually a problem of democracy. It's not a problem necessarily then of humanitarian marketing. I think the problem is much bigger than humanitarianism itself.
This is very interesting because, yes, it is a problem of democracy, and it is a problem of what policymakers want. And we've talked in the podcast in previous episodes about the collapse of liberalism, which is a frame of necessity, like the agreement on equal value of lives, the democracy, the human rights, and so on, doesn't really exist in the same way. Hence, there's no need for politicians to respond to the suffering of others in the same way. They are going for everybody else's evil and we're the good ones, and hence we don't need to do this anymore. In the middle of this, humanitarians need to market themselves and the people they serve. And as much as I cringe at the word marketing itself, but we are selling an issue for resources and attention of politicians who have their decision. Is it different now? Is it worse because politicians are worse, or is it just today's version of what has been going on forever?
What I find interesting for what we've been dealing with and what we've been prioritizing as communications towards audiences that we're looking to inspire and mobilize here in Canada and beyond with Doctors Without Borders, we're finding ourselves having to retreat to Humanitarianism 101. We're not spending as much time talking about here's what you need to know about the warring factions and what's leading to this humanitarian crisis. Of course, there's a little bit of that happening as well, but I find myself compelled to go onto LinkedIn and say, hello, protection of civilians, no instrumentalization of aid, you cannot hold food as a bargaining chip in a conflict situation, there is a moral right, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is what we've come to. And I agree with Polly's comment that indeed, people who are aware and are armed with information, they are compelled to act. They are compelled to go out on the streets. We're seeing that in many parts of the world, sizable demonstrations as well. But indeed, I believe this is a moment where you have your civil society having to, in a way, remind leaders with power what it means to be humanitarian. And we are finding ourselves in a space where, we're treading on being more political. It's not that we've become more political. Our governments have become less humanitarian. That is what is staring us in the face today. And we're finding ourselves having to get down to the basics.
I would agree with all of that. And I will flip it 180 degrees. I mean, going back to the humanitarian basics, because as an educator, I actually think that humanitarian marketing has been in some ways too successful, or there has been a tendency amongst certain agencies, certain, organizations to present humanitarianism as the solution, right? Humanitarianism will fix the problem. And we know that that's not the case, right? We know that actually in reality, it's a politically minimalist response to crisis. But unfortunately, some of this marketing has been maybe too successful. And I have to repeatedly tell my students that humanitarians are not the Avengers, right? They are not going to stop the wars. They are not going to save everybody. They operate within a very restrictive, set of power relations that, state sovereignty still matters, who holds the guns still matters, and that actually humanitarianism cannot and was never actually intended to fix everything, right? That these issues are much bigger. They are political. They require systemic, structural, political change. To some extent, humanitarianism has been too successful in marketing itself as the solution, or maybe it's been marketed purposefully as the solution to many crises, many conflicts, because it actually removes responsibility from those with political power from having to act. And the responsibility has been placed onto the humanitarian sector. And as a result, engaged people then think that humanitarianism itself is capable of much more than it's actually capable of.
For sure. And I think that's a bit of a history repeating as well. I mean, the former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Madam Sadako Ogata, what did she say? There are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. And that's essentially what we're finding ourselves in. We're like, we need action, but we're doctors without borders. We cannot stop the bombs from falling. We cannot stop our medical facilities from being attacked. We cannot stop these violations of international humanitarian law. We need political solutions to these humanitarian problems.
And that might have been a legitimate argument when there were hopes of political solutions for humanitarian problems. And today, whether we're talking about Sudan or Gaza or DRC, or for that matter, the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, there doesn't seem to be any political solutions forthcoming. And I mean, we are going through a genocide that is live streamed, and there's an anti-politics to that genocide in the sense of all the liberal democracies are brazenly complicit in it and continue to justify it, continue to sell weapons, continue to make it possible for it to continue. Is it still reasonable to say that as humanitarians, we're doing all we can do, but there's nothing we can do because there's a blockade? Is there something more that should be taken on by the humanitarian sector beyond just saying we're not the solution? What is it that should be done?
That question inherently asks us to challenge some of our core principles of being neutral, of being impartial. It's one that has emerged as a question for us at Doctors Without Borders that we continue to grapple. How did those principles make sense with the assumption that global conventions were not being undermined as they are today? And given the fact that they are being undermined today, does that require a bit of a radical or not so radical shift in how we implement and envision those principles? And all the while, I mean, again, this is all while centering the agency of the people that we seek to assist and the communities that we assist. This is about, at the end of the day, whether it's about the engagement, the bilateral advocacy that we do, or otherwise, it has to be always centered on, is it that what we are doing makes ourselves sleep better at night, or does it make the people that we hope to assist sleep better at night? And I think that's what we need to be asking. Is this great for media as a tactic, or is this really going to move the needle in seemingly impossible and what we're seeing as intractable crises today? So you're hitting the nail on the head on a very sensitive, principled question that has been discussed within MSF and other humanitarian organizations as well.
I think this is also about where you draw the boundaries of humanitarianism, right? Is humanitarianism simply the INGO and UN sector, or is it people who want to help other people, right? And I think the industry, as we think of it, tends to be very protective about what humanitarianism is, and for very justifiable reasons. But if you take, for example, right now, there is a flotilla sailing across the Mediterranean attempting to break the siege. And there are people who are very happy to call it activist. Other people are calling it humanitarian. That is upsetting some people because they're activists, and there's a difference between activism and humanitarianism. But, this is, again, not a new thing. We saw this with the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, when large-scale organizations were slow to respond. Local grassroots people took it upon themselves to deliver assistance, to help when and where they could. And then, larger organizations responded later because they thought it looked, for a marketing purpose, looked bad that they weren't there. So I think, again, this is about who gets to determine what humanitarianism is. Is it someone sitting in an office in Amsterdam, or is it someone actually doing the work every day in their communities, wouldn't necessarily even consider themselves humanitarian, is just doing, basic mutual aid that they have done forever? But I think it's a much bigger question beyond just the principles, right? And I think we do really need to have a discussion about whether those principles still make sense. in our current political moment. But I think it's also a way about where we draw the boundaries about what is humanitarianism, who gets to call themselves humanitarian, and what kind of work we consider humanitarian work to be. Is it the very basic biopolitical saving of lives, or is it more expansive?
And now that I'm actually sitting in Catania in Sicily with the activists who are sailing those boats, and I think that discussion that's happening in the humanitarian sector on whether the breaking the siege is humanitarian or activist, is it political or not political, does it comply, is not even a conversation here. People are carrying aid, food, baby formula, and stuff, and trying to deliver them to people. There is, surprisingly to me, zero concern with what you call it. They're concerned about being shot at by drones. They are concerned about being arrested, as Ben Gavir announced this morning that they will be arrested as terrorists. But they're not concerned with not being called humanitarians. There is a very porous line between what is political and what is activist and what is humanitarian in their mind that I'm not used to, because I come from the humanitarian conversation where it is an iron wall, not a porous line. And this takes me to my next question. Is there potentially something to do with how humanitarians see themselves or how people see them? Is there a humanitarian image problem under the current political circumstances?
Again, here I would say a bit of the danger of a single story. Who is a humanitarian today has wildly changed. I think we are seeing significant strides in at least some humanitarian organizations. There's more work to be done always on who represents a humanitarian organization, what the makeup of people with lived experiences are, how much agency do we give to people experiencing humanitarian crises and having that be their home, and how much are they at the decision-making table wearing a humanitarian organization hat. And I think it's heartening to see intentionality behind placing that change in some places. So to your question of does humanitarianism have an image problem, I would say perhaps twofold. I think one is a positive change in the imagery where you have a lot of folks sitting in decision-making capacities that really know what it means to be a refugee and know what it means to be a humanitarian leader and know what it means to really walk the talk on the localization of aid, for example, on dignified representation, for example. But does the humanitarian image problem exist in that traditional, more romanticized, historical image that we've had of the humanitarian sector? I think there's a reckoning that's happening today. And I think there's a reconciling that we're all grappling with on what side of history do we want to be on, and what is the future of humanitarian aid, and how do we ignite a new era of humanitarianism, because this is what the world is demanding and asking of us to ignite, is a new era of humanitarianism, in which there is this porous definition really between humanitarianism and activism and political, that the world, that the general political zeitgeist of today is asking for a rethink of what the humanitarian sector looks like. And we would be remiss if not to embrace that and take that on and critically reflect.
I think it's really good that we have somewhat moved beyond the trope of the sort of heroic white savior sweeping in on his white horse to rescue everybody. And we're moving beyond that myth of the humanitarian cowboy to a certain extent. That person is gendered, male, and is white. So I think that's really important. But I also think, again, how are we defining humanitarianism? Who is doing humanitarianism? And I think there's a lot of good work going on within the sector that is reflecting on the kinds of things that Sana has just been talking about. And that's really, really important, positive work. But at the same time, as we know, since sort of the 1990s, we've had a mushrooming of the people who claim to be doing humanitarian work. And a lot of that humanitarian work is now being claimed by actors, which traditionally would have been seen as anti-humanitarian, right? So the military is now a humanitarian actor, right? And so when you have the military or you have the border police, Frontex, claiming to be engaging in humanitarian work alongside or with work that is actually militarist, is exclusionary, right, is designed to pursue particular sovereign state agendas, then I think there is a problem. And then it becomes difficult for people to differentiate between what is actually humanitarian. People in crisis situations are not sure about actually what the purpose of humanitarianism actually is. Is it there to assist them, or is it actually being used as a vehicle for wider political purposes? In some ways, certain agencies themselves have allowed themselves to be pulled in that direction. For example, if you take the UNHCR, allowed themselves to be the vehicle for increasing police presence in Kakuma camp by donating 34 jeeps to the Kenyan police. Is that work that actually the UNHCR should be doing? Is that humanitarian work, or is that actually assisting the Kenyan state in turning Kakuma into a more carceral space? Again, it's where we draw the boundaries about who gets to do humanitarianism. And I mean, I know that sort of traditional humanitarians, I've sat in meetings where, people are advocating for an increased role in the, for the role of the military in humanitarian assistance, and everybody who works for an INGO like flinches. But we have to be honest that this is where the money is going now. This is where the funding is going now. And so I think this is also when we want to talk about an image problem, people who care, I think, about humanitarianism, we need to be very aware that who gets to claim to be a humanitarian isn't just traditional INGOs, isn't just sometimes grassroots volunteer activists, but is also wider state power that is not traditionally understood as humanitarian.
So in recent days, I've been told by people benevolently criticizing what is coming out here, this discussion, that you're being harmful when you criticize the humanitarian system. You put it at risk of not working. And I don't know that this is the case. I mean, those who are putting the humanitarian sector at risk are those who are shooting at humanitarians and bombing them. But I think there is a point where humanitarianism can actually put itself at risk. I'll give you a couple of examples. When there are tens of thousands of people who are objecting to a live stream genocide, and yet major humanitarian organizations like the ICRC remain in that dogmatic space of, we're neutral, we're talking behind closed doors, trust us, we will do the right thing, you don't need to look behind those closed doors. When someone like Cindy McCain, the executive director of the World Food Programme, goes and visits the field in Gaza, and apparently she's been there for like a couple of hours, and then storms out of there, goes to Tel Aviv, and smilingly shakes hands with Netanyahu, who has an arrest warrant on him by the ICC, and issues a joint statement, and then says, oh, he was surprised by the suffering and the hunger. Is humanitarianism its own enemy when it comes to image? From a purely marketing perspective, how can a system undermine its own image that much? I mean, this isn't a general critique, and not every organization does that. And some are smarter at masking whatever they do that isn't appealing to the public, or do it right, actually. But why is it so difficult to just stick to we serve people? I mean, I remember in the 90s, the ads of UNICEF or Save the Children, pay 50 cents, we will feed a kid. Or, sacrifice one of your coffees a day and, a child will live better.
Children are dying every day from hunger and sickness. Innocent children, just like this one.
Did you know in many countries, 2 out of 5 little ones never even make it to their 5th birthday? In Bangladesh, a 4-year-old must drink from the same disease-infested water that the animals bathe in.
You can help save the life of a child like Tanzi, Kofi, or Aisha. We know what it takes to save lives. It takes us, you, and as little as £3 a month.
I almost have nostalgia for that kind of advertisement in the middle of the self-sabotage that the humanitarian sector is doing to itself now.
I'd say you're right. Not every organization in the nonprofit world perhaps defines or operationalizes neutrality in the same way. Speaking for my organization, for Doctors Without Borders, we have long held that our definition of neutrality is that we do not take sides in a conflict. It's an operational guideline, really, that ensures that we have the ability to provide medical assistance to populations in distress, regardless of any sort of background. But we've been very clear about the fact that neutrality is not synonymous with silence, and that there is a key element there that we believe that neutrality does not equate to silence. We believe in our strong pillar of bearing witness and témoignage when we do witness extreme violence, abuses, or unacceptable suffering. And we're all familiar with that. I think the inherent issue and the privilege that we have to be able to do that comes a bit from our funding model. I mean, let's also put that on the table. Not every organization has the privilege of being over 90% run through private donations, and the independence that gives us to be able to speak out about what we see against governments, against perpetrators. Not everyone has that. And that plays out, and that definition of neutrality therefore takes on different forms for some organizations versus others.
Yeah, I mean, not to defend Cindy McCain, far be it from me to be the person to defend Cindy McCain. I didn't think I'd be defending Cindy McCain on this podcast. Mum, what have you done? But I mean, I'm sure she would explain that Swift's, drive up the highway from Gaza to Tel Aviv to have a photo op as being the price of having to do business, the price of access, right? That's humanitarian diplomacy. And, she will say that she's the head of an organization which is, fundamentally reliant on government donor funding. So she can't necessarily, refuse those photo ops. She can't necessarily refuse and upset, for example, the US government or other European governments. So, I think that would be the argument that she would give as to why this has to happen.
I'm fine with that, Polly. Why do they not say it? I mean, I would be fine with an organization saying, you know what, if we act more politically, we would lose funding. Hence, this is as far as we can go. I'd have some respect for that. Why do we have to dance around this grotesque photo op and joint statements and pretend that they're doing the right thing and everybody goes happily home? Why can't we be honest about this image?
Because of the power of saving lives, right? I mean, and because the counter argument to that is if we say the quiet part out loud and we lose money, we can't do our job. We can't save as many people. And this is the contradiction. You cannot square this circle. The Gordian knot at the heart of humanitarianism. We all know that this is how the game is played. But if you say the quiet part out loud, are you then prepared for the repercussions of that, which is actually people are going to die? That's why I do this job and not your job, right? That's why I moved out of the sector and became an academic instead, because I didn't want to keep having to deal with those problems and those questions.
I think that's a disappointing ultimatum to put in. Shouldn't we refuse to resign ourselves to this being the foundation on which the most vulnerable depend? I mean, we all acknowledge that there are systemic challenges, inefficiencies, and inequities facing humanitarian aid far beyond the political display of that, as we're discussing. But how can we? There should be a radical refusal to resign ourselves to, well, this is what we're going to have to deal with. I mean, no vulnerable person in need should have to shrug their shoulders. And is this what they depend on? Is this the foundation of what humanitarian aid should be? We need to really critically reflect on that.
I mean, I agree, but I hear it all the time. Oh, but if we don't do this, this is unfortunately, the lesser evil within which we work.
The price of doing business.
The price of doing business.
You know what? I'm fine with that. I've done that before. You need access, you need to. But here, in this particular case, and in attempting to understand it, there's no access. There has been a blockade on Gaza, and McCain knows, and everybody knows, neither their silence is going to guarantee access, nor their, photo op is going to guarantee access. On the other hand, for those who say if we just open our mouth, we'll be kicked out, well, MSF opened its mouth and spoken aggressively. And I don't know, you'll tell me, Sana, if you have suffered disproportionately more exclusion than, say, the ICRC, for example. So the argument of we're doing this because of absolute necessity is falling apart. But yet, instead of reacting to it appropriately, that radical refusal that Sana is talking about is not happening. And part of it, have we become so politically docile Have we given up even on the image of, the torn jeans and the sort of duffel bag and going to the field in favor of three-piece suit executives that are hovering in Geneva and New York and doing business as usual? Why aren't we reacting to that change? Blockade has become normal now. We've seen it in Sudan. We've seen denial of engagement in DRC, where Rwanda says, "Oh, but we're not even there. What are you talking about?" And everybody has to play that. Why is the reaction of the formal system not uniformly that piss off, you are lying, and actually let's do something about it that goes beyond the polite smile and nod of a head and shaking hands with war criminals?
I think that's an interesting harkening back to who is a humanitarian and how are we redefining that today? When you say, why aren't we taking action? We are witnessing, as we've said, there are pockets in our global community that are choosing to overcome passive acceptance with collective action. We're seeing that out on the streets. Who are those humanitarians? How are they embracing and internalizing what it means to be a humanitarian? And what can humanitarian organizations learn from what we're seeing out on the streets, in the flotillas, in grassroots societies? I think there's absolutely something to look into there.
Yeah, it does come down to who is a humanitarian, but also who is overlooked as a humanitarian. I mean, we can talk a lot about the way in which, humanitarianism has become the way to, for example, govern Palestine over time, a way to placate a particular kind of Palestinian politics. And, I think a lot of these discussions around what can humanitarianism do in Gaza right now often tends to also overlook what Palestinians have been doing themselves for many, many years, for decades, using humanitarian relief efforts, but in a more political way, right? I think if we want to sort of realign humanitarianism to having a more political, liberatory agenda, so to speak, there's a lot the sector can learn from Palestinians. Unfortunately, I think, like many majority Western-oriented institutions, Palestinians have been overlooked for various reasons, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, etc. So in terms of sort of why do people just not say piss off? Do you really want my honest answer? Really? I think people are cowards, but I also understand why they're cowards, because people's jobs depend on it. Right? It's very, very difficult when, you have to also feed yourself and your family and pay your mortgage. Are you actually going to be the person that potentially runs your organization and institution against the wall? These are important questions. And I'm all for having a revolution, but I'm also aware of the material restrictions that some people have in being able to join that revolution. And so I think that actually what needs to happen is people need to hold space for a panoply of different options and actions, right? And I think that if you can't say piss off, and for very, very justifiable reasons, what you can do is hold space for people who are able to do that. And what you shouldn't be doing is maligning their efforts and sort of speaking as if you are the defender or you are the person that has the right to claim what is humanitarian action or what is aid and what is assistance. We as a sort of humanitarian community have to hold space for different ways of working and different ways of doing things.
There's a parallel here to journalism. When you hear, there are no journalists allowed in Gaza when 200 journalists have been killed in Gaza, there's also an argument of, humanitarians aren't allowed in Gaza. Well, there is plenty of humanitarianism happening there, be through mutual aid and people opening spaces to each other, collaborating and talking and helping each other under extreme conditions. There's humanitarianism happening on the Mediterranean now that is different. But again, we're going in circles and touching on this, the difference between the humanitarian regime, the humanitarian system, and humanitarianism. And I'll be the first to agree that there are many humanitarianisms outside the system. But first problem arises is they don't have a place on the table. I mean, we all know that, this whole localization agenda that has started 10 years ago has gone nowhere, except to give more, ways for many intermediary international organizations to call for and spend money. But there's also an argument, and we've had Tom Fletcher recently on this show. And in his view, the humanitarian sector has gone a bit wonky and jargony, and that made it a bit too hard to connect with the average person. It's almost saying, only if we were able to talk about stuff straightforward. Is that reasonable argument, or is it that, the jargony, wonky bit is just a reflection of a deeper problematic conception of the politics of humanitarianism? It's one thing to say, if we start breaking down the acronyms and saying them full, then we'll be fine. I don't think that's a reasonable assumption. There's something deeper than that refuses to connect with people outside.
Part of what is deeper than that and has been ruptured and laid bare for us is in light of how we started the conversation when you spoke about the USAID cuts, right? USAID cuts. What did that expose? It exposed an inherent fragility of this mega INGO model and an over-reliance on international funding. It doesn't matter put a lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig, right? That's the phrasing that's used in the United States. There's an over-reliance on international funding. So wonky or not, jargon or not, the system inherently is unsustainable. And that's what we've seen with what came up in contemporary history with the USAID cuts. I hear you on localization of aid has gone nowhere, but does it need a rethink today? Perhaps a reimagining of that today? Because the USAID cuts have shown that this is the model that exists today is not resilient, it's not sustainable. When a single donor reduces its funding, it's an entire system that's thrown into chaos. That's just inherently unfair to those that are reliant on that. And to me, that is a bigger question and a conversation to be had of how do we make humanitarian aid, I won't use the word resilient, that has a lot of nuances to it, but how do we make it meaningful? And what is the future of that going to look like as we move ahead? There are these seismic shifts happening as they relate to the delivery of aid, the funding of aid, the discourse and the critical calling out that we are engaging in today as well around aid. Where do we go from here? And we cannot go back. We cannot go back. We have to move ahead.
So, has humanitarianism become sort of too technocratic, too jargon-filled, too wonky? Again, I think that depends who you ask. Who is your audience for that? I think the average person on the street doesn't know, right? They're not reading these reports that are full of kind of new public management speak and whatnot. They don't know what a log frame is, right? No, I don't think in that sense, if we're talking about marketing, that's necessarily a problem for the, average Joe on the street. But what I do think is, alongside the fact that the USAID cuts have really highlighted exactly how fragile the system is, I think what we also see is the way in which programming has in so many ways been, donor driven. And that's where I think the jargon comes in. That's where, all this sort of particular forms of reporting come in, which is perhaps what, is being meant by this sort of move to technocratic jargon. That there is this, there's donor-driven programming rather than needs-based programming, rather than programming that is actually being driven by recipients themselves, crisis-affected communities themselves. And perhaps actually the collapse in funding means we're going to move beyond this problematic kind of reliance on donor-driven programming. We will wait and see. Maybe we will discover new forms of funding, new ways of doing this kind of work that is, as Sana says, meaningful rather than simply perhaps ticking a box, filing a report, saying it was done, pleasing the donor, but not reflecting on actually whether it was meaningful and did anything for the people it was intended to help. And when we say the people it was intended to help, there's always a question mark over actually who those people are in this instance.
Here we've gone and reached the somewhat predictable conclusion that it's not a marketing issue, it's a systemic issue. And it is an issue of who's a humanitarian, where does the funding and choice of humanitarianism come from, and who gets to have a say or have agency as to how they provide or how they receive humanitarian aid. Does then the messaging and marketing matter at all?
I would argue it does. It absolutely does. It will forever be the way to influence, inspire, mobilize hearts and minds in support of people that deserve to live a life of dignity as we all do. And that power of storytelling, I wouldn't call it marketing, but compassionate, empathetic, dignified, with equity, diversity, and inclusion at the forefront, and giving agency to the people that we're speaking about. That will forever be a value that should exist in how we choose to communicate about the work that we do and the communities that we seek to assist.
It absolutely matters, right? Because we know that it's necessary in order to actually get the resources to do the job. And it matters also because it can also do harm. We've seen how bad communication, bad marketing, whatever we want to call it, actually leads to, huge forms of harm. So yes, it still really, really matters. And yes, it does matter because people's stories do need to be told, right? And I think, even if we're told by the likes of Elon Musk that empathy is a weakness, right? I don't think that's true, right? Empathy is a strength, and we should be able to, know people's stories, understand their suffering, and hopefully be able to act on that. And that does require, I really hate this word marketing. This does require communication, storytelling, whatever. But with the recognition that, it's important because it can also do harm. So it has to be done in such a way that is sensitive to the communities that it's seeking to speak for or on behalf of.
The last question here. We have listeners here who are largely people who work in the sector, are adjacent to the sector, or are policymakers. What do you want them to do? What would you ask a listener to do other than absorb this and internalize it? What can we do to move forward?
I think first off, let's arrive at a common recognition and acknowledgement that global humanitarian action is at a pivotal juncture today. Even if you were to look at the gap between what aid costs and what funding is available, that's grown fivefold over the past decade. Let's agree on some of these foundational contexts that we're finding ourselves in. Let's agree that there are protracted crises that are straining global response capacities, and that what we used to call unprecedented needs, they're no longer unprecedented. They are the status quo. And I would say what's really important, as difficult as it may be for those listening, is to see, much to Polly's terms about empathy, is to also see hope in these times, not just as a vague concept, but it is our imperative, and we owe it to the people that we work with and that we assist and that we speak about and that we research on, individuals who face each day with courage and dignity, to embody that hope ourselves. And I hope that this discussion leads those that are listening, that it propels them to some form of action and moving from a bit of a collective wisdom to tangible change in the spheres of influence that they may have access to or exist in.
I would say in the current context that we're in, to fight the reflex, I think, to sort of circle the wagons and to actually have and embrace a more expansive view of what humanitarianism can be, to think about how you can work in solidarity with folks who are muddling through, who are just trying to just get this stuff done without the resources, without all the jargon, without all of the, baggage that the sector as a whole has accumulated over the years. So to have a more expansive view of humanitarianism, maybe a less arrogant view of humanitarianism, like approach this work with more humility, open up space, and not make themselves this urge to sort of sometimes make themselves the main character, right? When something happens, right? That's something that's actually systemic. It's a much wider issue, but I think that the tendency tends to be to sort of see this as, okay, well, what does this mean for humanitarianism? Well, this is a humanitarian problem, when actually, of course, we know that it's a much bigger problem.
Polly, Sana, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism. Our show is produced, edited, and mixed by Levi Sharp. Editorial oversight provided by Erwin Loy, Eric Reddy, and Freddie Buswell. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. Please rate and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider becoming a member of the New Humanitarian to help us continue reporting from the heart of crises. Go to www.thenewhumanitarian.org to find out more.